podcast started with a conversation. Paul Wesley and myself were talking about how many fascinating people there are in Totnes, so we decided to invite some of those people to tell their stories. Each guest nominates a friend to interview. That friend then interviews one of their friends, and so on. The interviewee becomes the interviewer, making links in our Totnes chain. This second chain features people who are involved in the arts and is 5 links long. This first episode features Ben Piper, ex-mayor of Totnes. Benedict J. Piper, mostly known as Benji, was born in Bohemian West London in 1961. Eventually bailing out from the hard-drinking lifestyle in Soho, Benji's mother returned to Dartington, where she'd been at school, and Ben was sent to various schools, including Dartington, before leaving a year early with virtually no qualifications. Being a political and creative person, his father had been arts editor at The Economist, Ben soon gravitated towards the creative community, despite observing that everyone in my family are artists and miserable and broke. I'd rather be a vet. Ben helped develop the Free Festival movement and was involved in the emergence of the New Age Traveller in opposition to nuclear arms, culminating in the occupation of the US AAF by the Green Collective in 1984, which precipitated the largest use of troops on the mainland and a series of acts outlawing the New Age Traveller community. Ben and his family fled abroad, travelling through Spain and France before coming back to England and driving a horse and cart to beat the legislation outlawing New Age travellers. He became a pyrotechnic, leading to work with the Welfare State, Emergency Exit Arts and others, as well as creating the Greencraft area of Glastonbury. As he puts it, running out of people who understood what I was talking about, Ben returned to school at the age 35 and got a BA in Fine Art. There followed years of community arts in different areas of Bristol and then Manchester, specialising in making beautiful things and then burning them. He eventually returned to Totnes and became a town councillor, an instigator of the Flat Pack Progressive Group and eventually a 2-term mayor, under which Totnes was nominated as one of 5 best town councils in the country. Ben's song is World Upside Down by Billy Bragg.
In 1649 to St George's Hill, a ragged band they called the Diggers came to show the people's will. They defied the landlords, they defied the laws. They were the dispossessed, reclaiming what was theirs. We come in peace, they said, to dig and sow. We come to work the lands in common and to make the waste grounds grow. This earth divided, we will make whole. So it will be a common treasury for all. The sin of property we do disdain. No man has any right to buy and sell the earth for private gain. By theft and murder they took the land. Now everywhere the walls spring up at their command. They make the laws to chain us well. The clergy dazzle us with heaven or they damn us into hell. We will not worship the God they serve, the God of greed who feeds the rich while poor men starve. We work, we eat together, we need no swords. We will not bow to the masters or pay rent to the lords. We are free men, though we are poor. You diggers all stand up for glory, stand up now.
Hello, Ben.
Afternoon, Paul.
That was a wonderful song. I think that might be my favourite Billy Bragg song. It's really rousing. It's a much more rousing version than the Leon Russellson version. Who wrote it? Leon Russellson wrote that song.
Oh, was it Leon Russell who actually wrote that song?
Did,
it's not traditional then. For some reason I had an idea that it was...
No, there is a traditional song.
I think there is.
Pryor or someone sang a original version. But it's nothing like
If
that.
I agreed with you, I'd be showing my age as well. You know?
Why did you choose that song, Henry? It's just a wonderful, rousing song, but what does it mean to you?
Well, I love that song, and I think it reminds me very, very much of a particular sort of point in my life where I did something that I was sort of particularly proud of, and which was a sort of confluence of different ideas coming together into practical action, which was the occupation of Molesworth USAAF Airborne Base by the Green Collective for the Green Gathering in 1984, and we occupied the land for the benefit of the common good, and made it a place of celebration, and we planted wheat for Eritrea, which was harvested and then shipped out to Eritrea, which was actually kind of closing a circle between sort of social justice and economic rationality, you know, which has never been more important now. You know, we're living in this extraordinary situation where everybody's been beggared by the economics of energy, which is in turn destroying the planet. You know, so you know we've got to break this circle, and somewhere along the line we've got to empower people to kind of do what's right rather than do what they're not do that which they are afraid of doing on the basis that the sheriff's men's going to come and have them.
Yeah, that's a wonderful example. Actually, I wasn't aware of that. Growing corn on the Molesworth Air Base, Centre Eritrea, is the best example of sorted ploughshares that I can think of.
Yeah, I'm immensely proud to have sort of led the convoy on, you know, which was a sort of mobilising that discontent towards a somewhat focused and creative approach to protest. You know.
So, can I scroll you back just a moment? How did you get to that space? Was it your teachers at Dartington Hall School that steered you in that direction? I'm being provocative here, but you did go to you're an alumnus of Dartington Hall School, right?
Yeah, I think I've said this before when asked this kind of question. It's like, you know, the most important thing that came from the immense privilege which it was to inhabit that amazing space that was Dartington in that era. We're talking sort of late 60s, 70s. You know, was the liberty to do something because why not? You know, and I think that is a kind of, it's like a distillation of something that is one of the strengths of the of the British character, actually, although that kind of came from Dorothy Amherst's idea of living a many and very varied life, but yeah, that kind of in the ethos of the place there was definitely an underlying question that we needed to be progressive in order for the planet to survive. And I mean, I'm really completely serious about this because I was taught about global warming when I was, you know, in 1976. You know, it's not like this has been any kind of a surprise. You know, there was sort of expectation that we would translate that privilege into action, and I think that's been quite hard for quite a lot of Dartington kids, because not least because when I was there it had become quite ramshackle, I suppose, in lots of ways. It was it had become the sort of last resort for, I think, for quite a lot of kids from very wealthy but quite troubled backgrounds, you know.
Who was the head when you were there? Was it Curry, was it?
Oh crikey, no way! I'm that weird, rare creature, the second generation Dartingtonian. My mother was there under Bill Curry in the 30s.
That makes more sense. Yeah.
But there'd been, you know, various other people, Charles and Russell Lambert people. I was under John Whittick, who was the best English teacher that I have ever had, was just absolutely scintillating. But I think, it wasn't easy for him to take on the combined, all the things that were involved in being a headmaster. No, like I say, he was a fantastic English teacher and a brilliant man, no question about it. But it was a very difficult period for the school. Yeah.
So would you say he and presumably others at the school and at that time inspired you to become involved in the arts and the creative processes, and what was happening in this area at that time, or when you left the school, what was going on that you got involved in?
Well, I bailed out of Dartington. I decided I wanted out of there, and I went to the local sixth form to do A levels, because I was too young to leave school, so I had to go and start doing something. So I started getting I actually didn't want to have anything to do with the arts, because all my family were artists, and it's a cliche, or rather I often say this, but they were all miserable and broke, so I wanted to do something sensible. But then I didn't really know what to do, and I messed up my academic. It was a very difficult time, and I got lousy A-levels, so I wasn't going to get to be a vet like I wanted to be. So then I started hanging out with creatives, and the first thing was, and I mean, when I look back on it, it kind of boggles me that it's like, it's kind of getting on for sort of 45 years ago that I was part of starting Transact Arts in Totnes in like 1976, something like that. Which was a community arts initiative to access arts, utilise a derelict building, very much a sort of a pattern of the way that we kind of used to be possible to kind of engage with community arts in those days.
This was the time when there was a lot of creativity in the arts, a lot of sort of radical movement in the arts. And one manifestation was what were called happenings. Was anything like that happening around here, or was it all going on up country in London and in other cities? What was going on here? And I know that there were festivals going on in this area too at that time, weren't there?
I mean, for me, I'm kind of the happenings thing was something that my parents and their generation were doing. I was the child of those sort of happenings, and from that sort of concept of situationalism. I mean, my folks were very much kind of situationist. If one looks at an academic analysis of the thing, but but for me, it was taking the idea of the event rather than the generation of a discrete object or something in the material, and translating that into an appropriate art form. And for what happened for me was I started living in a bus, and then I started going to festivals, and part of that in that era was very much the mobilisation towards Greenham Common, and then there was, as I said before, Molesworth, and we picketed Alconbury and Lake and Heath and a whole bunch of other air bases, because we had this, this awareness that the economy really wasn't working for people, but neither were the larger politics. But that idea of that sort of situationist idea of creating a temporary autonomous zone for people to experiment in, or just stop and stare, without the usual contract that you have between audience and the progenitor of whatever art, the performer. Creating that free space, was something that seemed to be of value to me. It seemed to have a great, was a work worth doing.
So those ideas about the arts and about community, they overlapped with very political ideas that are manifested in peace camps, and as you mentioned earlier on, Greenham Common. I know quite a bit about Greenham Common, but nothing about Molesworth. Can you fill me in on what happened at Molesworth and what was going on there?
Well, there'd been a kind of crossover between the kind of libertarian expression of the sort of free festivals, which weren't really terribly political in their essence. You know, they weren't done for political reasons. There was much more just a sort of an experimental free zone. But then there was this, in parallel, there was running a real concern. I mean, it's hard to remember that era when people of my generation, you know, and I'm 61 now, you know, but remember being sort of brought up as a child with a sort of 3-minute warning. You know, the idea that there would be the siren would go off and there would be 3 minutes before there was a large flash in the sky. I remember, you know, with the civil defence material coming out saying, you know, take a door off its hinges and prop it up behind the sofa, you know.
Protect and survive.
Protect and survive, yeah, you know. And I mean, I did a theatre piece about that, actually, at a festival. So I remember back in that era, in about 82, 83 or something. But yeah, I mean, you know, that was kind of serious, you know, that sort of idea that was kind of like, you know, tenable in any kind of way, shape or form. So we really did need to put some pressure on. And we got this was the Thatcher came in 79, and we had the sort of the Thatcher Reagan axis sort of pushing us towards a very much more hawkish attitude to Europe, which, you know, again, there are resonances about that at the moment because of you know, obviously the situation in the Ukraine, and whether there's some revision required in terms of how the Soviet Union. That's a long, complicated question, but yeah. So there was a threat then, and there's a threat now. So the Americans were threatening to base mobile cruise missile facilities, and they were going to be based at those air bases. So yeah, the women's movement stepped up and engaged with Greenham, and there was a bit of a crossover there with you know, what became sort of New Age Travellers, and but then the Molesworth was, as it were, the Greens kind of doing a sort of a broader based thing. So there was a green gathering, which, you know, still is a big green gathering, which lots of people love, and it happened somewhere. It used to happen at Worthy Farm or somewhere in Somerset, and we just went, well, why don't we do it on an airbase, you know? As it is extraordinary how sort of easy it was really to just sort of wander onto an airbase and occupy it, and we had a festival which was fantastic, and I mean, it's you know, fabulous space, you know, great big wide flat bit of grass, you know, so, and then some people stayed on after the festival. It actually coincided with the one of the first really brutal assaults on the itinerant, the new itinerants that had moved in, had stepped up, well, had sort of moved into the void left by the dispossession of traditional travelling communities that had been basically corralled onto reservations. So there was a gap in the market for knife grinders and fruit pickers and all these sorts of things, and there was a really brutal assault on what was known as the convoy in those days at Nostell Priory, which predates the Beanfield by a year, which is the more famous event that everybody's aware of. But so there were quite a lot of refugees, literally kind of refugees in their own state, that washed up at Molesworth in terrible distress from having their homes wrecked and violently assaulted, robbed, beaten, all sorts of things that we don't really associate with being British. And a community stayed behind, and the naissance of what became known as the Rainbow Village on the Road is kind of quite complicated, but the Molesworth was a large part of that. So a community stayed there for the winter. And I think it was about March time that the Home Secretary then, with Michael Heseltine, mobilised, I think it was 3,500 Royal Engineers and troops, and they put up a fence overnight. But it was the largest mobilisation of troops on mainland Britain in peacetime since World War II. Kind of made an impression there, and in fact, apparently, actually, the fence got taken down again fairly rapidly. But that's not part of the story that I'm particularly aware of myself. So yeah, there was this confluence of a lot of unemployed people, a lot of discontent, a lot of anxiety, and actually finding kind of positive ways to sort of harness that energy and focus it into fight, like the words of the song, back to Billy Bragg, discover new ways of being, looking forward, and equality for all, those sort of ideas.
But that period, in my recollection, only lasted for about 10 years. Am I wrong, or what happened to it? I mean, where did it go?
Yeah, I think I mean, that's quite a question. But yeah, no, and I think it's interesting. The Gypsies talk about wagon time, which was the sort of 150 years when they travelled with horses and actually had wagons, because they weren't actually allowed to have horses until the sort of 1820s. But and from about 1820 through to sort of 1920, the 30s, sort of the sort of golden era of Gypsy. They call it wagon time, and with us, it was like bus time. It was a bus era, and you could literally buy a sort of an old bus out of service for, you could get 6 of you together and put your gyros in, and you could buy a bus and kind of just go down the road in it. It was amazing, and it was really emblematic of the kind of freedoms that the British imagine themselves to enjoy. It is interesting. You asked the question about what was it I got from Dartington, and part of the saying about that was the why not, but that kind of entitlement to actually do what you want as long as it's not hurting anybody else. It is really in the British character, and there was an extraordinary melting pot of the children of, and I'm talking now about the new travellers sort of movement, and there were some very posh people involved with that, and it was a really interesting moment, a really interesting melting pot. And yeah, like you say, I think that the politics and the economics changed. Well, I mean, there was a whole string of the legislation specifically banning us from more than 3 people walking down the road in a line was a protest march and needed to have permission. Music of a repetitive beat. I mean, it's funny. My generation, it's like we just sort of, these are sort of standing jokes, about the way that the powers that be just bent over backwards to try and identify what it was about us that they hated. Was it, so we had, and the first, I lose track of all the different public order bills and criminal justice acts and all the rest of them. And then we just, again, we've just been through a whole another cycle of it, of politicians promising their populist base all kinds of completely undeliverable stuff that the police just roll their eyes and look at the other way, and the courts will prove that it's actually fundamentally against human rights. I mean, I firmly believe that. Like I say, I've sort of seen 3 or 4 attempts by politicians to bypass the sort of tradition of natural fairness that I think actually does underpin our notions of who we are as a culture, who the Brits are. We like to think that we're actually freedom-loving, generous-hearted people.
Well, there certainly seems to be, you're right, certainly seems to be echoes or repetitions of that phenomenon right now with regard to freedom to demonstrate and make too much noise. And let's just hope the police do throw up their hands and decide that they can't enforce these ridiculous regulations rather than use it as an excuse to charge in as they did at times.
Something that has changed, I think, is that the police are less inclined to allow themselves to be used for strictly political purposes in the way that they were in that era, which was really, really poor. But I think 20,000 of them being cut by Theresa May a couple of years ago has not been. They haven't actually managed to make it any better by promising to rehire 20,000. That certainly hasn't happened yet. So then the police have become the service of last resort, as they say themselves. They're the ones who will always answer. And we are just in the most astonishing situation of a sort of Byzantine spiral down into chaos. And it is, waiting 24 hours outside a hospital in an ambulance for A&E. I mean, this stuff is just completely bonkers.
Let's not get too depressed. Let's
Sorry,
talk about the.
Was that the way I was holding my head in my hands?
Let's talk about the golden past.
The golden past and that era,
Of nuclear threat and everything else, it was great.
Actually, Sheffield University did a very interesting study of the shift actually in youth culture between the festival movement and the rave scene, and there was a fair bit of crossover there. They made it impossible for us to do festivals, and by 1992, 93, Pilton, Glastonbury was pretty much the only independent festival kind of going. But what there were loads of raves, and you had this crossover, the rave circuses, where you got travellers would take the sites and build all the infrastructure up, and then the ravers would turn up with the punters and the talent and their drugs of choice. And I actually think that there's a great piece of work to be done around the nature of drugs. I mean, the existentialists in Paris in the 20s drank an awful lot of coffee.
And absinthe.
Well, and absinthe as well, yeah. And then, obviously you were in the era of Haight-Ashbury and the psychedelic summer of love. No, I'm sure you didn't know. And actually, the kind of free festival movement that emerged in the after sort of in the early 70s, because it started with Windsor Great Park and then morphed into Stonehenge and then all the sort of other things, was very much based on psychedelics, and then rave culture came along, which was actually based on methyl dimethamphetamine, which is a kind of very different drug actually, and I think the aesthetics of the thing shifted, and I'm not really quite sure how much progress has been made creatively, and I will get shot down, and I'm showing my age on all this, but between the sort of late or mid 90s and the 20s, it all seems a bit samey to me compared to the sort of 30 years before, where we had we had punk, we had the hippies, we had the mods, rockers, all the sort of different manifestations of youth culture. I don't know, what is it? Did youth culture grow up and get a job, or I don't know quite what happened there.
So what was happening in Totnes and this area at that time? I mean, there were some festivals that came and went. There was music in the Civic Hall, and you must have been involved in.
Well, I mean, a part of the reason I picked Billy Bragg, of course, was because I was honoured to do lights for Billy Bragg on at a gig that I think you organised way back in the day, and I was trying to remember what date that was. I think it's around sort of 87 or something. Of course, there had been a really lovely. We were fortunate to have the fallout from people who'd been organising traditional medieval style fairs in East Anglia called Albion Fairs, and a sort of splinter group from them came down to Totnes and started a thing called Hood Fair, which if you dressed up in fancy dress, I think you got in for peanut, got in for a £5 instead of sort of 20 quid or something, and so everybody dressed up as peasants and got very muddy, and that was a fantastic event for several years, brought some amazing sort of talent into the area. I'm trying to think of some of them. If I said Theatre of Fire or yes. Bruce Lacey or the Friends Roadshow, things like that. I mean, again, I'm showing my age because they were all incredibly important, sort of seminal figures in a movement that sort of has become huge and ubiquitous. I mean, it's 300 quid for a ticket for Glastonbury now, and kind of it's become a sort of almost obligatory kind of rite of passage for teenagers to do Glaston's or somewhere else. So ultimately, I think we really, really succeeded in reinventing rites of passage for young people and adolescents and teenagers.
There was Elephant Fair as well, wasn't there?
And there was Elephant Fair as well. Yeah.
I think, I'm not imagining this, that I saw the Pogues actually play at Hood Fair, probably the last Hood Fair.
Yeah. That was the Pogues played at, they did, yeah. Which, yes. Well, yes, there was a... yes, the Pogues. Well, there was quite a mixed feeling about that, because actually it was the presence of the Pogues and the fact that they were a really nationally recognised group that, as it were they were sort of perceived to put Hood Fair on the map nationally, which all the Albion Fair people had actually said, Saskia and Tarby and people said, no, that's really not a good idea, because it raised the profile of the festival, so it became a kind of fixed point in the kind of larger festival calendar, and then of course it kind of got a bit swamped in a variety of ways, really. But do you remember Footsbarn doing the Tempest in a Tempest? I mean, that was they were touring. That was one of the most amazing theatre things I've ever seen in my whole life. Was in their tent, in their round tent, and they did the Tempest in the round, in a tent, and we actually had a thunderstorm, and it was just spine tingling, and that was a couple of years before Footsbarn said to the Arts Council, too little, too late, goodbye, and left for France, where they're now an institution.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
And there was a lot more going on in the Civic Hall in Totnes in those days too. You must have been involved in those. I mean, was it the River Bottom Nightmare Band? Was that what they were called? Yes, it is, wasn't it? River Bottom Nightmare.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember the dancers there. It used to
fantastic.
Be the whole age cross-section of the community, grandparents and grandchildren and everything in between were there dancing together to local bands.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the most exciting, gratifying thing ever to see in Totnes is that thing where you do get, grandparents, out celebrating with their grandchildren, and there was a I guess there was a kind of golden era of the Civic Hall, because you were doing there was kind of the rock against racism kind of movement, and there was all the gigs against apartheid in South Africa, and things like Misty and Roots and Black Uhuru coming in.
Yes,
fantastic.
Yes,
and but of course the back in those days, the health and safety allowed us to have 600 people in the building. which has been cut down to 300. And of course we are just now, I mean, we're 5 years in, but there was 20 years where we weren't really allowed any live music in the Civic Hall because nobody was really challenging the legalities of it.
Well, that was a very sad episode.
Yeah.
In the arts in Totnes.
But we you know, the great thing was that we were able to be the stepping stone between Exeter and it actually was there was a Cornwall Coliseum, I think was the next huge venue. You know, so I mean, we had. I don't know. It's one of those things that sort of every time you mention it, somebody else remembers the Clash playing or the Jam, or you know, I don't know. We had all sorts of people. I remember Desmond Decker, and Video Killed the Radio star Bruce Woolley, and of course Billy and those incredible reggae bands I mentioned.
Yeah, some great events. Can I just? You were involved at one time with the Commonwealth Institute with the youth theatre group there.
Yeah.
What were you doing there? I presume you weren't acting. I think you were you acting? Spill the beans.
Well, I've become relatively eloquent, articulate these days. But I was always in those days. I was very, very, very tongue-tied. So I really couldn't do lines. But no, I actually was writing and directing the first two productions for the Commonwealth Institute Youth Theatre group, because I got a little bit of understanding of script writing. I'd been working with since we'd done Transact Arts, and then out of Transact Arts came a sort of a film group. We got a bursary from the BFI to develop a script. So I was working with students at Dartington on that. So I had some idea about how to write a narrative in theatre. So I did that and spent kind of 18 months doing that, which gave me a grounding in theatre practice and television production. And yes, actually I did ballet for 18 months. I actually got to the point where I could lift my legs straight up above my head. You know, it was very painful though.
That's a revelation.
Can we have just written that down?
Yes, can we have?
And then
you've got photographs.
And then my whole shtick was kind of writing and writing for screen and photography and things, and then filmmaking from that. And then I had a terrible incident where I had literally every single thing that I'd done for the last 3 or 4 years in a large Gladstone bag, which got stolen out of the back of my car. And I lost my entire portfolio for sort of years, maybe as much as 5 years. And I just gave up writing and went into performance of the non-verbal variety. And this kind of coincided with taking up with one of the very seminal groups, which was a thing called the Tibetan Ukrainian Mountain Troupe, which was like the concert party for the convoy. And we started doing. They had been doing circus at festivals, and then I toured with them doing street circus, and evolved from a very bad, scary act with lots of fire blowing and chains and broken glass into quite a funny strongman act with only a little bit of fire and a little bit of chains and things.
Didn't you bring some of these skills to play on Fear Island? I seem to remember.
Trying to think. I mean, I the only time that I've ever really burnt myself really significantly fire breathing was in Totnes. I've always remembered there's a bit of a tradition about not showing off in your hometown actually as a performer. So I've always been a little bit reticent. But God, over the years there's been so many different events. We did the floating lantern sculptures down the river after Welfare State came here, and I did work with Welfare State, doing pyrotechnics with them, manifesting their Lord Dynamite show, which was just fantastic, and that was a wonderful example of bringing first rate practitioners into a community context, and actually at least 3 theatre companies emerged out of that experience of having that really, really top company, which Welfare State International were right in the ground floor of a whole genre of community-based celebratory arts companies. Emergency Exit in London, Walk the Plank in Manchester, Brithgoth in Wales, Same Sky in Brighton. They're all out of the same stable, and lots of crossovers. And I mean, they, I guess, sort of provided the sort of bedrock of sort of community engagement in a later era after the Labour government came in, and I people say, I'm trying not to sound like Donald Trump. People say, that.
No, don't try.
No, please don't. Let's not go there. I did a really bad thing last night. I watched that guy do his pitch for president. Anyway, the politics matters. The difference between being under a Conservative government for arts funding and being under a Labour government for arts funding is chalk and cheese. There's no two ways about it, and it matters.
So, what you've described is an extraordinarily broad range of what, I hope you'll excuse me calling, anarchist theatre, anarchist arts. And
I've got a new slogan for it. It's watermelon engagement. Yeah.
It's watermelon engagement.
Yeah, it's got a green skin. It's red on the inside, and it's black anarchist pips. Yeah.
Okay.
It's my.
All right, I like that. I like that. So I think you've answered my question, but I'll ask it anyway.
Or this might be the launch of the watermelon party if anybody wants to come and chow down.
Which is the symbol for Kherson, isn't it? It's there.
It is the symbol for Kherson, yes, which is particularly appropriate.
Yeah, isn't it? Just, I hadn't thought of that. But what I was wondering was, how did this broad experience prepare you for becoming His Honour the Worshipful Mayor of Totnes?
Yeah. Nothing could ever possibly prepare one for the honour. It has to be said, actually. I think I think I was probably more comfortable with putting the fancy dress clobber on than most of the previous incumbents. Yeah. I mean, I quite enjoyed actually sort of wearing the silly hat and and the robes and I mean hanging 2 kilos of bling around your neck, which is hundreds of thousands of pounds worth, and it's a very, very interesting business. The whole business of civic ceremony, yeah. And I mean, you're right, Paul. It actually facilitating the process of community celebration theatre. So funny enough, there is this business of the figures of authority. It's very traditional in a lot of cultures for figures of authority to actually make themselves ridiculous. Yeah, and that is like turning the world upside down, which cleaves back to the thread at the very beginning of this thing, and for me the greatest joy in being mayor was opening doors and actually making spaces available to people and not being afraid to be ridiculous. Actually, in a deadly serious kind of way, because I think some people were quite surprised about how traditional I was prepared to be with that, and actually, really took that stuff very, very, very seriously, because when you're representing a community that's got a constant, consistent history running back to 1349, you know, and it's written on the wall. You know, adding your name to a list of mayors that goes back to 1349 is a hell of a thing. And I guess I've always been interested in engagement rather more than the alternative. And again, I'll hark back to your era, Paul. You know, and I don't know whether you remember the what was it, the Fourth Republic or the Fifth Republic, the Soissons-Huit in Paris in '68, and Jean-Paul Sartre had a seminar with the people who were occupying the Élysée. Is it Élysée? No, the Lycée. Lycée in Paris, and he said to them, look, you need to be the avant-garde. You can't be there's no such thing as an alternative. If you want to be an alternative, they'll just come and pick you off from a distance with high-powered rifles. You know, you've got to be in close. You need to be there, and that's actually always been my ethos with these things is actually occupy democracy, be the change you want to see, light a lamp, don't curse the darkness. You know, all those things. You know, act locally, think globally, and those all those slogans. You know, so I managed to give overt politics a swerve for a very, very long time. I probably had as mixed feelings about politicians as anybody else, you know. But then, yeah, I suppose kind of having found my voice, and actually I got press ganged into joining the council because they were short of members, and the town clerk was standing on one side and the mayor was standing on the other side saying, go on, go on, go on, go on, go on, go on, go on. So I said, oh, okay. So then I did 6 years, and then it was it became apparent that it seemed like the right time to kind of step up. And yes, I think people are really surprised to hear that I was ever inarticulate because people say, well, you never stop bloody talking now. But I had a terrible stammer. And a terrible lisp as well, you know, which actually I think performance really, really helped. I mean, that's the old trick for getting over your stammer is sing whatever it is you want to say. You know, if anybody remembers the King's Voice and that old story. So, and yeah, I'm quite good at projecting to the back of the room. I don't usually need a microphone.
Okay. Well, I'm going to suggest at that point that you and I get together with some others and we form a local choir to at least... A cappella choir to at least sing the Billy Bragg song that you started off with this conversation, because it's such a wonderful song, and I can imagine it being belted out on the streets of Totnes, with you perhaps in the mayoral robes yet again. What? Who knows? But thank you very much, Ben, for talking to me.
It's always really interesting to reflect on these things, and yeah, pleasure, absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Ben. The next episode will feature Ben speaking to his friend Fiona Green.